The lonely Duke hired a pregnant widow to cook for him. Then he froze when she said her name. A storm batters the windows of a vast, empty manor. A proud, battle-scarred nobleman sits alone at his long table, the fire crackling low. Into his hall walks a weary woman, heavy with child, her eyes steady, her hands trembling as she speaks her name. The church bell tolls, servants whisper. The Duke's face goes white. Her late husband's name is tied to the very betrayal that ruined his family's honor. And yet, as she kneels by the kitchen hearth, her kindness stirs life in a house long dead. Meals bring laughter. Her prayers soften stone hearts, but shadows linger. Papers from London carry accusations of treason. If she stays, scandal could destroy them both. If she leaves, the manor falls back into silence. What secret truth lies behind her husband's disgrace? Will love mend the wounds of betrayal or tear them open once more? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The winter wind howled across the frozen Northumberland fields, whipping snow into ghostly shapes as Duke Edmund Hawthorne guided his black stallion home. His dark cloak billowed behind him, matching his brooding mood. The dreary afternoon cast long shadows across the manor's weathered stones, and Edmund's breath formed white clouds in the bitter air. Inside the manor's courtyard, stable boys rushed forward to take his horse. Edmund dismounted with practiced grace, his boots crunching on fresh snow. The familiar weight of responsibility settled onto his shoulders as he strode toward the entrance, where Mr. Collins waited with his ever-present ledger. "Your Grace," Collins bowed slightly, his graying hair ruffled by the wind. "I must remind you about the urgent matter of the cook. The kitchen has been in disarray these past weeks." Edmund removed his gloves with sharp movements. "Must we discuss this now, Collins?" "I'm afraid so, Your Grace. We've received an inquiry from a qualified candidate who has traveled some distance. She awaits your convenience." Edmund's jaw tightened. The thought of interviewing servants held little appeal, but even he couldn't deny the declining state of his household. "Very well. A brief interview, nothing more." As Edmund settled into his study, the fire doing little to warm the spacious room, Collins departed to fetch the applicant. Moments later, a gentle knock announced their return. The woman who entered moved carefully, her advanced pregnancy evident, despite her modest black dress. Her face, though tired from travel, held a quiet dignity. She executed a careful curtsy, one hand steadying herself against the weight of her child. "Your Grace, may I present Mrs. Margaret Hawley," Collins announced. Edmund, who had been examining some papers, froze at the name. His head snapped up, dark memories flooding back, of battlefield smoke, of men crying out in pain, of his cousin William Hale's betrayal that had cost so many lives. "Hawley?" His voice was sharp as winter frost. "Any relation to William Hawley?" "Margaret's." Hands clasped together, but her voice remained steady. "His widow, Your Grace." The room seemed to grow colder. Edmund rose slowly from his chair, his face pale with suppressed emotion. "Leave us, Collins." The steward hesitated, glancing between them, before bowing and withdrawing quietly. "You dare come here?" Edmund's words cut through the air. "To my home?" Margaret lifted her chin slightly, though her voice remained respectful. "I come seeking honest work, Your Grace. Nothing more." "Work?" He laughed without humor. "In my household? The widow of a traitor?" "I understand your feelings toward my late husband," Margaret said softly, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "But I must think of my child. I have skills in the kitchen, references from good families. I ask only for a chance to prove my worth." Edmund paced before the fire, his shadow dancing against the wall. The woman's presence stirred memories he'd rather forget, yet something in her quiet dignity gave him pause. She stood straight despite her obvious weariness, neither cowering nor demanding. 3 days you traveled? He asked abruptly. Yes, your grace, by public carriage. In your condition? Alone? I had no choice. Simple words, but they carried the weight of necessity. Edmund turned to the window, watching snow swirl against the darkening sky. The practical part of his mind reminded him of the chaos in his kitchens, of meals served late and poorly prepared. His household needed a skilled cook. Yet could he trust anyone bearing the name Halle? You will stay until week's end, he said finally, his voice cold. On trial. But mark this well, I will tolerate no deception, no schemes. One hint of dishonesty, and you leave immediately. Is that understood? Yes, your grace. Thank you. Margaret's relief was visible, though she maintained her composure. Edmund pulled the bell rope sharply. Collins will show you to the servants' wing. Begin your duties tomorrow. As Margaret followed the returning Collins from the room, Edmund sank into his chair before the fire. The flames cast flickering light across his haunted features as he whispered a name that still tasted of ash and betrayal, William. Dawn had not yet touched the horizon when Margaret Halle made her way down the narrow servants' staircase. Her hands traced the rough stone walls for balance, one palm resting protectively over her swollen belly. The kitchen hearth lay cold and dark, but she soon had a fire crackling, its warm light pushing back the shadows. Despite her condition, Margaret worked with practiced efficiency, rolling up her sleeves and tying on a clean apron. Her fingers moved through the familiar motions of measuring flour and yeast as she prepared bread dough. Finding comfort in the routine she had known since childhood, the first servants to arrive stopped short in the doorway, surprised to find the kitchen already alive with activity. Mary, the young cook's assistant, watched wide-eyed as Margaret kneaded the dough with strong, sure movements. Good morrow, Margaret smiled warmly. I hope you don't mind my early start. I thought we might begin with fresh bread for breakfast. Mind? Mary stepped forward, drawn by Margaret's gentle manner. It's been ages since we've had proper fresh bread here. The last cook only served fancy French rolls that went stale by midday. Soon the kitchen filled with the pleasant bustle of morning work. The scullery maids, Ellen and Beth, found themselves sharing stories as they peeled vegetables for the day's stew. Margaret listened with genuine interest, offering kind words and showing them little tricks to make their work easier. My mother taught me that if you add a bay leaf to the pot, Margaret explained, stirring the rich broth, it brings all the flavors together beautifully. The girls leaned in, eager to learn from someone who treated them with such respect. As morning stretched toward noon, the kitchen grew warm and fragrant with the smell of baking bread and simmering stew. The aroma drifted through the manor's corridors, reaching Duke Edmund as he paced restlessly through the halls. He paused, his steps faltering as the homey scent stirred memories he'd long buried of simpler times. Before war and betrayal had hardened his heart. Almost against his will, his feet carried him toward the kitchen. He stopped in the shadows of the doorway, watching unnoticed as Margaret taught Mary how to shape a loaf of bread. Her hands moved with gentle patience, her smile encouraging as the girl attempted to copy her movements. That evening, Edmund sat alone at his massive dining table, the only sounds the tick of the grandfather clock and the soft clink of his silver spoon against the bowl. The stew was simple fare, a far cry from the elaborate French dishes his previous cook had insisted upon serving. Yet he found himself taking another spoonful, and another, the wholesome flavors reminding him of meals shared in better days. When the butler hovered anxiously nearby, Edmund set down his spoon. It was adequate, he pronounced quietly. In the kitchen below, where the servants gathered to hear the verdict, a ripple of relief passed through the staff. They knew their master well enough to recognize the compliment hidden in his sparse words. Later that night, Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to her attic chamber, a small space tucked beneath the eaves. A single window looked out over the snow-covered grounds, and her few belongings fit easily in the battered trunk at the foot of her narrow cot. Yet as she lit the single candle, the room felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since her husband's death. Kneeling beside her bed, Margaret's whispered prayers rose soft and steady in the darkness. Lord, grant me strength to face whatever comes. Protect this innocent life I carry. Her hand cradled her belly as she continued, help me build a safe home here, away from the shadows of the past. In his chambers directly above, Edmund lay awake, her murmured words drifting up through the old floorboards. His hands clenched into fists as her surname echoed in his mind hail, the name that had haunted him since his cousin's betrayal. Yet, he could not deny the quiet dignity in her prayer, or the way her presence had already begun to warm the cold halls of his home. He turned restlessly in his bed, torn between the bitter memories her name evoked and the grudging respect her actions had earned. The sound of her prayers followed him into uneasy dreams, where past and present merged in shadows he could not quite grasp. The church bells rang clear across the frost-covered village, their peals echoing through the crisp Sunday morning air. Inside Hawthorne Manor, servants hurried about in their Sunday best, while Margaret smoothed her plain black dress, adjusting the modest collar. Her pregnancy made movement awkward, but she maintained her composure as she joined the households. Procession to church. The village church stood proud against the winter sky, its ancient stone walls dusted with snow. As custom dictated, the servants filed into the back pews while Edmund took his place in the elevated family stall. Margaret settled quietly among the other staff, folding her hands in her lap and keeping her eyes lowered in prayer. But prayer proved difficult as whispers rustled through the congregation like dead leaves. Ahale, here? The name passed from lip to lip, carrying old poison. William Hale's widow, in service to the Duke? An elderly woman crossed herself, muttering about treachery and war. That family brought nothing but shame. Margaret felt the weight of every stare, every whispered word. She kept her chin level, hands clasped tightly together, but her cheeks burned with the effort of maintaining dignity. The familiar words of the service washed over her as she focused on breathing steadily, one hand occasionally moving to rest protectively over her child. Edmund, from his elevated position, could see it all. His jaw clenched as he noticed the sidelong glances, the pointing fingers barely concealed by prayer books. The morning light streaming through stained glass cast colored shadows across his face, hiding the storm in his eyes. As the congregation filed out after the service, the churchyard became a battlefield of a different sort. Lady Frances Hawthorne, Edmund's aunt, cut through the crowd like a ship through rough waters, her silk skirts rustling with determination. She cornered Edmund near the family crypts, her voice sharp despite her seemingly pleasant expression. "Nephew, you cannot be serious about this arrangement." Lady Frances gestured dismissively toward Margaret, who stood apart from the crowd. "Housing that woman invites disgrace upon us all. Have you forgotten what her husband did?" Edmund's response came swift and cold. "The matter is not open for discussion, Aunt Frances. My household staff is my concern alone." His words carried the weight of command, learned on battlefields far from this peaceful churchyard. "But the scandal," Lady Frances persisted, "is of no consequence." Edmund cut her off with brutal finality. "Good day, Aunt." He turned on his heel, leaving Lady Frances sputtering in his wake. Margaret had witnessed the exchange from a distance, reading the tension in Edmund's rigid shoulders and Lady Frances's pinched expression. When Edmund strode past her toward the waiting carriage, she spoke softly, "Your Grace." "Thank you." He paused, looking at her properly for the first time since her arrival. Something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or confusion, before he nodded curtly and helped her into the carriage, his touch impersonal but gentle. The return journey to Hawthorne Manor stretched long in silence. Margaret, sat perfectly still, watching the snow-laden fields pass by through the frosted glass. Each rut in the road made the carriage sway, reminding her of how precarious her position truly was. One word from the Duke, one push from his family, and she would be cast out into the winter with nothing but her good name, and even that, it seemed, was tarnished by association. Edmund sat opposite her, his attention seemingly fixed on some distant point beyond the carriage window. Yet his eyes occasionally drifted to Margaret's reflection in the glass, studying the quiet determination in her bearing, the gentle way she cradled her unborn child. In those moments, the ghost of his cousin William seemed to hover between them, the man who had betrayed not just Edmund's trust, but the lives of countless soldiers under their command. The carriage wheels crunched through fresh snow, marking their steady progress back to the manor. Margaret's reflection wavered in the glass like a spirit caught between two worlds, the one she'd left behind, and the uncertain future ahead. Edmund watched that reflection, his expression unreadable, as memories of battlefield betrayal warred with the evidence of quiet dignity before him. The flickering light of the kitchen fire cast dancing shadows on the stone walls as dusk settled. Over Hawthorne Manor, Margaret stood at the broad wooden table, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread, though her movements had grown slower as the day progressed. Her face was pale, and beads of perspiration dotted her forehead despite the winter chill. Pressing a flour-dusted hand against her swollen belly, she drew in a sharp breath as pain seized her middle. The sensation was different from the usual. Stirrings of her child sharper, more urgent. She gripped the edge of the table, waiting for it to pass. The kitchen door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air along with the Duke of Hawthorne. His riding boots were mud-splattered, his dark cloak dusted with snow. He had intended only to request hot water for washing, but the sight of Margaret's white face made him pause. "Mrs. Holly?" Edmund stepped forward, his usual stern expression giving way to concern as Margaret swayed on her feet. "Your Grace, Her words faltered as another pain gripped her. The room began to spin, the firelight blurring before her eyes. Edmund crossed the kitchen in 3 swift strides, catching her just as her knees buckled. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms, her head falling against his shoulder. "Send for Dr. Morris at once," he commanded, his voice echoing through the corridors as servants scrambled to obey. Margaret's slight weight in his arms stirred something in his chest, something he had thought long buried with his wartime memories. The doctor arrived within the hour, his bag clutched in his weathered hands. After examining Margaret in her small chamber, he emerged with a grave expression that made Edmund's chest tighten. "She must have complete rest, Your Grace," Dr. Morris declared, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. The strain of kitchen work could bring the child too early. "A few weeks of quiet will make all the difference." Edmund nodded, his jaw set. "She will have it." When he entered Margaret's chamber, she was propped up on pillows, her hands folded protectively over her middle. "Your Grace, I cannot abandon my duties," she protested weakly. "You will rest," Edmund said firmly, then softened his tone. "Perhaps. There are lighter tasks you might manage once you are stronger, the household accounts or menu planning." Margaret's eyes brightened slightly. "Thank you, Your Grace. I would feel better being of some use." That evening, Edmund found himself taking supper in the small parlor near Margaret's chamber, rather than his usual solitary meal in his study. A simple soup and freshly baked bread had been brought up for them both. As they ate, the silence between them grew comfortable rather than strained. Perhaps it was the warmth of the fire, or the lingering concern from the afternoon's events, but Edmund found himself speaking of things he had told no one. "They were good men," he said quietly, staring into the flames. "Loyal soldiers who trusted me to lead them when the ambush came." His voice grew rough with memory. Margaret's soft voice filled the silence. "May I pray for them, Your Grace?" Edmund looked up, startled. In all the years since the war, no one had offered. Such a simple comfort. He nodded, unable to speak as Margaret bowed her head. Her prayer was gentle, remembering not only the fallen soldiers, but also those who mourned them. As she spoke, Edmund found his own head bowing, peace stealing over him for the first time. In years, when the candles had burned low, Edmund rose to escort Margaret back to her chamber. She walked slowly, one hand trailing along the wall for support. Without comment, he took up her candle, lighting the way through the darkened corridor. At her door, Margaret turned to thank him. The candlelight caught the softness in her eyes, the gentle curve of her cheek. Edmund found himself unable to look away, caught in a moment that seemed to stretch between them like a thread of gold in darkness. Then, as if waking from a dream, he stepped back abruptly. His heart hammered in his chest, a sensation he had not felt since his youth. Without another word, he turned and strode away, leaving Margaret standing in her doorway, the candlelight flickering behind her. Snow drifted past the kitchen windows of Hawthorne Manor, but inside, warmth and laughter filled the air. Margaret stood at the broad wooden table, her dark skirts dusted with flour, surrounded by 5 eager-faced children of the manor's servants. Their small hands plunged into bowls of dough as she guided them in the ancient art of bread-making. "That's right, Jenny," Margaret encouraged the cook's daughter, who beamed with pride as she folded the dough just as shown. "You want to feel it become smooth under your fingers like silk." "Like the Duke's fancy clothes?" piped up Tom, the stable master's son, earning giggles from the others. "Perhaps not quite so fine," Margaret smiled, adjusting young Mary's grip on her portion. "But good bread has its own sort of glory, doesn't it?" Unknown to the merry group, Duke Edmund Hawthorne stood in the shadowed doorway, drawn by the unusual. Sounds of joy echoing through his typically somber halls. He watched, transfixed, as Margaret demonstrated the proper kneading technique, her movements sure despite her advanced pregnancy. The kitchen, usually a place of mere utility to him, had transformed into something altogether different, a sanctuary of warmth and light. "When I was your age," Margaret began, helping little William shape his dough into a proper loaf, "my mother taught me just like this. In our village we had only one oven, you see, and all the families would bring their bread to bake." "What happened if someone's bread got mixed up?" asked Sarah, the laundress's daughter, her eyes wide. "Oh, that was the best part." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Every loaf had its own special mark. My mother always pressed a tiny heart into ours. When the bread came out golden brown, all the children would hunt for their family symbol." The servants, passing through, paused in their tasks, drawn into her tale. Even Mrs. Pierce, the stern housekeeper, lingered by the pantry door, her usual frown softening as she listened. Edmund found himself stepping closer, careful to remain unnoticed. The sight of Margaret, surrounded by flour-dusted children, and sharing stories of simple village life, stirred something long dormant in his chest. She had brought life back to these cold stone walls, transforming his manor into something that felt, for the first time in years, like a home. That evening, Edmund did something unprecedented. Instead of dining alone in his study, he appeared in the servants' hall just as supper was being served. A hush fell over the room as he entered, servants half rising from their seats in shock. "Pray, continue," he said, taking an empty place at the long wooden table. "I find myself curious about Mrs. Hale's cooking." Margaret, seated among the staff, felt her cheeks warm as she served him a bowl of hearty stew. The room held its breath as he took his first spoonful. "This," Edmund declared, his voice carrying clearly through the silence, "is excellent. I haven't tasted its equal since my mother's time." The tension broke like spring ice, warmth flooding back into the room. Conversation resumed, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Edmund noticed how the servants, from the youngest maid to the oldest groundskeeper, turned to Margaret with genuine affection, seeking her opinion or sharing small jokes. Later, he overheard two maids defending Margaret fiercely to the butcher's wife, who had repeated village gossip about the Hawley name. "You don't know her," one declared. "She's got more goodness in her little finger than those talebearers have in their whole bodies." As the evening drew to a close and the servants retired one by one, Edmund remained by the kitchen hearth, watching as Margaret tidied away the last of the supper things. The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and her movements, though slowed by her condition, held a grace that drew his eye. When she finally turned toward the door, their gazes met. The smile they shared was brief but full of unspoken understanding, an acknowledgment of the quiet revolution that had taken place in his household. For a moment, the space between them hummed with possibility, warm as fresh-baked bread, sweet as shared laughter. Then Margaret dipped into a small curtsy, maintaining proper form despite her dignity. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Mrs. Hawley," Edmund replied softly, watching as she disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, leaving him alone with the crackling fire and the lingering warmth of the evening's transformation. The great hall of Hawthorne Manor glowed with the warm light of dozens of beeswax candles. Their gentle radiance cast dancing shadows on the stone walls as servants and staff gathered for the modest 12th night celebration. Holly branches and winter greenery decorated the wooden beams above, and the scent of spiced wine and fresh-baked treats filled the air. Margaret stood near the hearth, her dark gown softened by the firelight. She watched with quiet joy as the manor's inhabitants shared stories and laughter, their usual formality loosened by the holiday spirit. The kitchen maids had outdone themselves with traditional treats, warm gingerbread, sugared fruits, and small meat pies that steamed invitingly on wooden platters. Hush fell over the gathering as Duke Edmund entered the hall. He stood awkwardly, in his formal black coat, clearly unaccustomed to joining such informal festivities. But there was a softness in his expression that had been absent months ago when Margaret first arrived. "Please," he said, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "continue your celebrations." He moved through the crowd, nodding at servants who bowed or curtsied, until he reached Margaret's side. "The hall looks transformed," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "I cannot recall when it last held such warmth." Margaret smiled, her cheeks coloring slightly. "12th night has always been special to me, Your Grace. It reminds us that light returns even in the darkest season." As the evening wore on, the servants gradually relaxed despite their master's presence. Old Thomas, the gardener, took up his fiddle, and several couples began to dance. Edmund watched, something wistful crossing his features. "Would you walk with me?" he asked Margaret suddenly. "The gallery is quite beautiful by candlelight." Margaret's heart quickened, but she nodded, following him from the great hall into the long gallery. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, mixing with the glow of wall sconces to illuminate the portraits of Edmund's ancestors. They walked in companionable silence until Edmund stopped, turning to face her. "Miss Hale Margaret," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I must tell you something." She waited, hardly daring to breathe. "When you first arrived, I nearly sent you away because of your name," he admitted. "I was blind with old grief and bitterness. But your courage, your honesty, you have brought life back to these cold halls. I find myself looking forward to each day, knowing you are here." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "My lord, she gathered her courage. "After William died, I thought I would never feel love again. I carried such shame with his name, such loneliness. But here, with you, I have found peace I never thought possible." Edmund stepped closer, his hand gentle as he touched her cheek. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he whispered. "You are the most honorable person I know." The space between them seemed to disappear. Edmund lowered his head slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. But Margaret lifted her face to his, and their lips met in a kiss as soft as a whisper. Her hand found his sleeve, steadying herself as warmth bloomed in her chest. "Your Grace, Your Grace!" The sharp cry shattered the moment. Edmund and Margaret broke apart, both flushed and breathing quickly. A young stable boy ran toward them, boots echoing on the stone floor. "A writer from London, Your Grace. He says it's urgent." Edmund's jaw tightened, but he kept his hand at Margaret's elbow, supporting her as they returned to the great hall. The celebrations had paused, servants gathering at the edges of the room as a snow-dusted messenger bowed low, extending a leather packet sealed with wax. Margaret watched as Edmund broke the seal and unfolded the papers within. The candlelight caught the harsh lines that suddenly appeared around his mouth, the darkness that clouded his eyes as he read. Whatever news the message contained, it was not good. His hands tightened on the paper, crumpling its edges. The warmth and joy of moments before seemed to drain from the hall, replaced by a heavy tension that made Margaret's heart beat faster with worry. The winter morning light filtered weakly through the study's frost-touched windows. Edmund stood. At his desk, the London papers spread before him like a map of misfortune. Margaret watched from a few steps away, her hands clasped tightly at her waist, anxiety etching lines around her eyes. "These documents," Edmund's voice was hollow as he traced the yellowed pages with trembling fingers. "They tell a different tale of William's disgrace." He lifted his gaze to Margaret, pain evident in his features. "Your husband, my cousin, was accused of signing papers that aided our enemies during the war." Margaret's face paled. "That cannot be true," she whispered. "William was many things, but never a traitor." "The evidence was buried to spare the family further shame," Edmund continued, his words heavy with bitterness. "But now these accusations resurface, threatening not just his memory, but all of us." Before Margaret could respond, the study door burst open. Lady Frances swept in, her silk skirts rustling with righteous fury. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the scattered papers, Margaret's presence, Edmund's troubled expression. "So the truth emerges at last," Lady Frances declared, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "A traitor's widow, warming herself at our hearth." She turned to Edmund, her face severe. "You cannot possibly consider binding our noble house to such scandal. Think of your position, your duty to the Hawthorne name." Margaret stood straight, despite the weight of accusation. "My lady, I knew nothing of these charges. William never." Silence. Lady Frances cut through her words like a blade. "You dare speak in your defense? Your very presence threatens to destroy everything the Hawthornes have built." She rounded on Edmund. "Dismiss her at once, nephew, before word spreads further." Edmund's face had grown mask-like, the warmth of recent days freezing over. He wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes as he spoke. Perhaps it would be best if you left, Mrs. Hawley, for both our sakes." Margaret felt the words like physical blows, but years of hardship had taught her to bear pain with dignity. "I understand, Your Grace," she said softly, using his formal title for the first time since their kiss. "I shall gather my things." The walk to her attic chamber seemed endless. Margaret moved slowly, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other trailing along the familiar walls. She had known such happiness here, fleeting though it was. The kitchen maids watched with tear-filled eyes as she packed her modest trunk, but none dared speak against the Duke's decision. Within the hour, a hired cart waited in the courtyard. Snow had begun to fall, thick white flakes that muffled the world in silence. The driver helped Margaret climb aboard, handling her carefully in deference to her condition. She settled among her few possessions, wrapping her worn cloak tighter against the cold dot as the cart began to move. Margaret allowed herself one final look at Hawthorne Manor. Through the study window, she glimpsed Edmund's tall figure, rigid and dark against the glass. Tears spilled down her cheeks, freezing in the winter air. She thought of their brief moments of joy, the shared smiles across the kitchen, the warmth of his hands as he helped her rise, the tender kiss that promised So much more. Edmund watched the cart disappear down the snow-covered lane, his fists clenched at his sides. Every fiber of his being screamed to run after her, to damn propriety and scandal alike. But generations of nobility weighed upon his shoulders, and fear, that insidious companion, whispered of duty and family honor. He remained motionless as Margaret vanished into the swirling snow, taking with her the brief spring of warmth that had touched his frozen heart. Lady Frances's voice cut through his thoughts. "You've done the right thing, nephew. The Hawthorne name must remain untainted." Edmund said nothing, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the window frame. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing all traces of the cart's passage, as if Margaret had never been there at all. 2 days after Margaret's departure, Hawthorne Manor stood silent as a tomb. Winter winds whistled through empty corridors where warmth once dwelled. In the kitchen, where laughter and the aroma of fresh bread had reigned, only cold ashes lay in the hearth. The morning porridge, prepared without Margaret's loving touch, sat heavy and flavorless in wooden bowls. Below stairs, servants exchanged worried glances. "The house feels cursed again," whispered Mary, the scullery maid, as she scrubbed pots without enthusiasm. "Like all the lights been snuffed out." "His Grace hasn't touched his meals proper since she left," added Thomas, the footman, shaking. "His head just paces about like a ghost, he does." Above, in his study, Edmund indeed paced. 10 steps to the window, turn 10 steps back. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved, a restless soul trapped in his own home. Letters and documents lay scattered across his desk, correspondence from the war, military orders, personal notes from William. "Something isn't right," he muttered, running fingers through his disheveled hair. He'd read these letters a dozen times since Margaret's departure, and with each reading, the inconsistencies grew more glaring. Dates that didn't align, orders that made no sense. William's increasingly desperate tone in his final weeks. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called out, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Sarah, one of the younger maids, bobbed a nervous curtsy. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace. While cleaning Miss Margaret's room, I found this." She held out a small, worn prayer book. "Should I dispose of it?" Edmund took the book carefully, as if handling a precious relic. "No," he said softly. "Leave it with me." Alone again, he sank into his chair, turning the prayer book over in his hands. Its leather binding was soft with use, the pages well thumbed. As he opened it, a folded piece of paper fluttered to his desk. The handwriting was instantly familiar, William's bold, slanting script. His hands trembled as he unfolded the note. The paper was dated the night before William's final battle. "My dearest Margaret," Edmund read aloud, his voice catching. "If you are reading this, I have fallen. You must know the truth. The orders I signed, the ones they call treasonous, were my choice alone. Our regiment was walking into a trap. By appearing to aid the enemy, I diverted their forces, saving our men from certain massacre. I choose disgrace over the deaths of hundreds. Forgive me for leaving you with my shame. Know that I died protecting those under my command, as any true soldier must. All my love, William." Edmund's hands shook as he set down the letter. "Dear God," he whispered, "he was no traitor. He sacrificed everything, his honor, his name, his life, to save his men." The revelation struck him like a physical blow. All these years he'd carried hatred for a man who died a hero. And Margaret, dear, gentle Margaret, had borne the weight of that undeserved shame in silence. "Jenkins!" Edmund's shout brought his butler running. "Have my horse saddled immediately." "But sir," Jenkins protested, "the roads are treacherous with ice." "Damn the ice!" Edmund snapped, already reaching for his heaviest riding coat. "I've let pride blind me too long. I must find her." The manor burst into activity as word spread. Servants rushed to help their master prepare, hope lighting their faces. Cook packed a small bundle of bread and cheese, in case the journey proved long. Thomas ran to alert the stables. Even Lady Frances's dire warnings, delivered by messenger, went unheeded. Edmund strode through the entrance hall, William's letter secure in his breast pocket. Outside, his horse stamped impatiently, breath steaming in the cold air. The entire household had gathered to see him off, their faces glowing with approval. "Bring her home, Your Grace," called Mary boldly, voicing what they all felt. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled servants. Edmund swung into the saddle, gathering the reins. "I intend to," he declared, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "God willing, I'll not return without her." The servants' cheers followed him as he urged his horse forward, out through the gates, and onto the snow-covered road. He knew Margaret had spoken of a cousin in York. It was a place to start. The winter wind bit at his face, but Edmund barely noticed. His mind was filled with thoughts of Margaret's gentle smile, her quiet strength, the way she'd brought his cold home back to life. "I'm coming, Margaret," he whispered into the wind. "Wait for me." The winter sun hung pale over the village square as Margaret made her way slowly through the muddy streets. Her black widow's dress, now somewhat worn, offered little warmth against the biting wind. She kept one hand protectively over her swollen belly while clutching a small basket in the other. Market day usually brought life and bustle to the square, but today the cheerful calls of vendors fell silent as Margaret passed. Women gathered their skirts and turned away. Men tipped their hats downward, avoiding her gaze. The whispers followed her like shadows. "There goes the trader's widow," one woman muttered behind her hand. "Brought shame to his Grace's household, she did," another added, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Margaret lifted her chin, though her heart ached. The kindly seamstress who had taken her in had warned her about venturing out, but they needed bread, and Margaret refused to hide away in shame. Suddenly, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones echoed through the square. Gasps and exclamations rippled through the crowd as a magnificent black stallion came charging in, its rider none other than Duke Edmund Hawthorne himself. Edmund's cloak billowed behind him as he dismounted in one fluid motion. His boots struck the ground with authority, and his voice rang out across the square. "Gather round, good people of the village. I have an announcement that must be heard by all." The villagers drew closer, moths to flame, their curiosity overwhelming their usual deference. Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her basket forgotten in her trembling hands. "Many of you, Edmund," began, his voice clear and commanding, "have spoken ill of the name Halle. You have whispered of treachery and betrayal." His eyes swept the crowd, who shifted uncomfortably. "Today, I stand before you to proclaim the truth of Captain William Hale's final days." He withdrew a letter from his coat, holding it high. "This document, written in my cousin's own hand before his last battle, reveals his true sacrifice. William Halle took blame for treasonous orders to protect his men, my men. He chose disgrace over seeing his soldiers condemned. He died not a traitor, but a hero." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks as her late husband's name was cleared at last. Edmund's gaze found her then, and his expression softened. He strode toward her, boots striking the cobblestones with purpose. The crowd parted before him like water. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed square, "I have done you a grave injustice. You brought light and warmth to my home, showed kindness to my household, and awakened my heart, and I repaid you with doubt and rejection." He took her hand in his, and though they stood in the public square, his touch felt as intimate as a whisper. "Before all gathered here, I declare my intention to make you my bride. Your child shall be my heir, raised in love and honor, as William would have wished." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "The scandal." "Let them talk," Edmund said firmly. I choose love over pride, truth over rumor, and you over all else. He squeezed her hand. Will you return home? To our home? For a moment, the square held its breath. Then Margaret nodded, a smile breaking through her tears like sunlight through clouds. Yes, she whispered. Yes, with all my heart. The silence shattered as cheers erupted from the crowd. The same villagers who had shunned her moments before now pressed forward with congratulations and blessings. Even the most gossiping tongues turned to words of joy. Edmund helped Margaret into his waiting carriage with tender care, ensuring she was settled comfortably before climbing in beside her. He removed his heavy cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands lingering protectively. As the carriage began to move, the church bells began to ring, their clear peals echoing across the village. Margaret leaned against Edmund's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence and the security of his love. The bells sang of vindication, of truth revealed, of love triumphant, and most of all, of new beginnings. The whole village watched as the carriage carried them toward home, the bells continuing their joyful song long after they had passed from sight. Spring sunlight streamed through the manor windows, bringing warmth to halls that had known only winter's chill. The once somber estate buzzed with joyful activity as servants hung garlands and polished silver for the wedding feast. In the Duchess's chambers, Margaret stood before a tall mirror, hardly recognizing herself in the cream-colored silk gown that flowed gracefully over her rounded belly. The servants had woven white flowers into her dark hair, and her cheeks glowed with happiness. "You look like an angel, Miss Betty," the kitchen maid whispered as she adjusted the lace at Margaret's wrist. Sarah, the housekeeper's daughter, dabbed happy tears with her apron while arranging the veil. The village church filled to bursting, with nobles and common folk seated side by side, a sight unprecedented in living memory. Lady Frances, finally won over by Edmund's steadfast love, sat beside the baker's wife without complaint. The mingled perfume of spring flowers and beeswax candles filled the air. Edmund waited at the altar, tall and proud in his finest coat. When Margaret appeared in the doorway, his stern face softened with such tenderness that several women pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes. Their voices rang clear through the hushed church as they spoke their vows. Edmund's deep voice caught with emotion as he promised, "I take thee, Margaret, as my wife, and this child is my own, to love and cherish until my dying day." Margaret's answering words came soft but sure, her hands steady in his. The great hall, so long empty and cold, now overflowed with celebration. Fiddles played merry tunes while children danced between the tables. Servants and nobles alike shared in the feast, passing platters of roasted meat and fresh bread. Laughter echoed from the rafters, warming the ancient stones. As evening fell, Edmund led Margaret into the garden where lanterns glowed like earthbound stars among the early spring blooms. He drew her close beneath a flowering pear tree, taking her hand and pressing it to his chest where his heart beat strong and steady. "Before you came," he murmured, "these halls were as empty as my heart. Now both overflow with life and love." His fingers brushed away the joyful tears on her cheeks as he whispered, "At last home. Thank you for watching." Stories like this remind us who we are. If something touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that just might stay with you.